In a coastal city bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, Malik, a man of Afro-Caribbean origin in his 40s, walked with confidence. His tailored deep blue suit contrasted elegantly with his ivory shirt and impeccably polished shoes. Malik exuded a natural aura of self-assurance, effortlessly drawing attention. After an enjoyable lunch at a small bistro he frequented on quieter days, he strolled toward his car, an elegant silver-gray sedan. The bistro staff knew him well. He always ordered the same meal: scrambled eggs, crispy turkey bacon, and a side of fresh fruit salad. They took care to ensure everything was perfect for him. As he stepped out of the restaurant, Malik glanced briefly at his phone and saw a message from his sister reminding him about their family dinner that evening. He smiled, replying briefly to reassure her he would be on time. Just as Malik approached his car, two police officers stopped in front of him. Their dark uniforms contrasted with the serene ambience of the evening, and their gazes remained fixed on him. One of the officers, a stocky man with a clenched jaw, spoke first, his tone neither aggressive nor friendly. "Good evening, sir. We need to ask you a few questions," he said, standing straight with his hands near his belt. Malik, though slightly taken aback, remained calm. He nodded politely and replied in an even tone, "Of course. How can I help you?" The stocky officer took a step closer, glancing quickly at his partner before continuing. "We've received reports of suspicious activity in the area. Someone matching your description," he said, consulting a small notebook briefly while carefully avoiding Malik's gaze. Malik felt a familiar tension rise in his chest. This scenario was all too familiar to him. He had lost count of the number of times he had been judged solely on his appearance. A black man, well-dressed, in an affluent neighborhood. Situations like this rarely ended as simple misunderstandings. With a tight-lipped smile, Malik responded, "I see. I'm sure this is a misunderstanding. I was just having lunch at the nearby restaurant as I often do. I'm heading back to my car to go to work." The officer didn't seem convinced. He turned slightly toward his partner, a younger man with sharp, distrustful eyes who remained silent but alert, his arms crossed as though the situation required greater scrutiny. "You know, sir, in this neighborhood, we're not really used to seeing people like you." The stocky officer hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "People like you in cars like that." Malik felt a chill settle over the conversation. Those words, though cloaked in politeness, struck him as judgment, a weight he constantly carried. His gaze hardened slightly, but he kept his composure. "If you're referring to my car," he said, glancing at the silver sedan, "you should know it belongs to me, just like my right to be here on this road at this hour." The officer seemed to puff himself up even more, a faint glimmer of superiority in his eyes. But Malik, knowing full well how quickly confrontations could escalate, chose not to fuel the tension. "I understand your concern for safety," he continued, speaking slowly, "but it's important not to judge someone based on their skin color or appearance. We all have the right to be here, whether for lunch or work." The younger officer, who had been silent until now, spoke in a softer but equally wary tone. "Could you please show us your IDs, sir?" Malik hesitated for a brief moment. He knew that refusing could escalate the situation rapidly. Yet the thought of having to justify himself again, simply because of the color of his skin, left a bitter taste in his mouth. He resented being trapped in this position, having to answer questions solely because he seemed out of place in this neighborhood. Still, he knew ignoring the officer's request would lead to worse consequences. Taking a deep breath, he calmly retrieved his wallet and handed them his ID. The stocky officer examined Malik's ID briefly before handing it back. Malik returned it to his wallet, slightly relieved but still on edge. The tension lingered, an invisible cloud hanging in the air, ready to erupt at any moment. He waited for the inevitable question, something heavier, but instead, the officer simply said, in a tone that was almost indifferent, almost too detached, "Thank you, sir. You're free to go." Malik, though relieved that the situation hadn't escalated, couldn't shake off the strange feeling that engulfed him. Distrust, that sense of not being fully seen, of not being treated like any other citizen. He got into his car and turned the key. He was about to leave when a murmur came through the radio of the young officer. The two officers exchanged a meaningful glance. Quick, almost imperceptible, but Malik caught it. A chill of unease ran through him. As he was about to turn the corner, hurried footsteps sounded behind him. He turned just in time to see the stocky officer, now joined by a third, heading toward him with a sense of urgency. They seemed far more determined now, as if orders had come from higher up, as if they decided something was amiss. The stocky officer placed a firm hand on the hood of Malik's car, his voice now more authoritative, less neutral. "Sir, we need to check your vehicle." Malik opened his mouth to protest, but thought better of it. He knew that any form of confrontation could make things worse. This wasn't a routine check. It was insistence, deliberate pressure. Pressure he'd felt before, but this time, he wasn't sure he could avoid it. Slowly, he got out of the car, raising his hands in a gesture of submission but also silent defiance. He refused to let himself be destabilized. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but he increasingly felt like a stranger in a world that was supposed to be his. "I assure you, there's nothing illegal in my car," he said calmly, despite the tightening grip of injustice around him. His voice, even measured, carried a note of frustration he could no longer hide. But he needed to stay composed. Though part of him raged against the unfairness of it all, he knew that giving in to anger would only make matters worse. The young officer, eyeing him with suspicion, began inspecting the vehicle while the stocky officer remained close to Malik, his piercing gaze unwavering. Malik could feel anxiety creeping in. Every minute spent under their watchful eyes was another minute of enduring this unwarranted intrusion. His mind raced, wondering how much longer this would last and why he had been singled out for this confrontation. He knew these officers weren't acting out of genuine suspicion, but rather their own bias. Simply being a black man in a car in this neighborhood seemed enough to arouse their doubts. Suddenly, the young officer exclaimed after discovering something in the trunk. "Hey, look at this!" The stocky officer quickly moved closer, his gaze sharpening. Malik, his throat tightening, tried to see what they had found, but the officers kept him at a distance, preventing him from seeing the object they had extracted. A knot of dread formed in his stomach. His thoughts raced as he wondered what they could have unearthed from his trunk. Papers, work tools, everything was perfectly organized. There was nothing incriminating, nothing that should have raised suspicion. Yet, the mere fact that they latched onto a discovery, no matter how trivial, made the situation far more tense. The stocky officer slowly turned to Malik, his expression growing more severe. The dynamic of the encounter had undoubtedly shifted. "Sir, it seems we've found something unexpected." Malik felt a wave of panic rising. He had checked his car before leaving. He knew that everything in his trunk was perfectly legal. Yet, in the officer's eyes, there was no longer any pretense of routine. A quiet anger simmered within him, but he maintained his outward composure. He knew every gesture, every word, would be scrutinized and interpreted through the lens of their judgment. He clenched his fists, trying to control his growing stress. "I assure you, everything in my car is in order," he said, his voice as calm as possible despite the mounting tension twisting his stomach. But his words seemed to drown in a sea of suspicion. The stocky officer fixed Malik with a piercing stare, his eyes betraying a determination that went far beyond a simple routine check. The young officer continued rifling through the trunk, pulling out items one by one, examining them with almost obsessive attention. Malik, his hands still raised in a gesture of submission, felt his heart pounding harder as the tension escalated. He wondered if the officers would eventually find something, anything, they could use against him. The third officer, still silent, observed the scene with a disconcerting intensity, as if waiting for the slightest sign of guilt. This heavy, oppressive silence amplified the unease gripping Malik. "Sir, we need you to accompany us to the police station for further verification," the stocky officer finally declared in an authoritative tone, leaving no room for negotiation. It was a cold, inescapable sentence. Malik felt a jolt in his chest. A whirlwind of questions raced through his mind. But why? he asked, his voice tinged with incredulity. I haven't done anything wrong. You've seen that everything here is in order. The stocky officer remained impassive, his face locked in an expression of cold authority. We've received instructions regarding an ongoing investigation. It's necessary to bring you to the station to clarify certain points. Realizing he had little choice, Malik resigned himself to following the officers. He knew that any attempt to resist could escalate the situation. They had already ensnared him, and his only option was to play by their rules, no matter how bitter it felt. They escorted him to the back of the patrol car, asking him to sit in the rear seat. The door closed behind him with a sharp click, echoing the claustrophobia now engulfing him. The sound of metal on steel reverberated in his ears, a noise symbolizing the loss of control, a transition from relative freedom to brutal submission. The stocky officer settled into the front seat without a word, and the vehicle started moving. Sitting in the back, Malik felt the weight of the situation overwhelm him. The view through the rearview mirror, with the road rolling away behind them, suddenly seemed endless, as though the journey to the police station would last forever. Every meter traveled was a reminder of the injustice unfolding before him. He knew this wasn't just a routine check. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a brutal reminder of systems that judged him before he even opened his mouth. The passing scenery blurred, but Malik felt frozen in a waking nightmare. The officers in the front remained silent, their indifference suffocating him further. They weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for a reason to arrest him, to make him bend, regardless of the facts. He had no choice but to wait and see how this would play out, even though he already knew the ending wouldn't be fair. On the way to the station, Malik replayed the events of the day in his mind. He thought about his sister, their dinner plans, and how unreal those moments now felt. His thoughts raced, searching for explanations, for reasons behind this new injustice. Upon arrival at the station, Malik was led inside by the officers. They passed a reception desk, where an on-duty officer glanced at him neutrally before guiding him into an interrogation room. The stocky officer had him sit at a table and began asking questions. Though worried, Malik tried to remain as coherent and calm as possible. He explained the details of his lunch, his interactions with the earlier officers, and the nature of his business. Minutes dragged by. Malik maintained a respectful and cooperative demeanor, but every second was a stark reminder of the absurdity of the situation. He knew the color of his skin and his appearance had played a significant role in this wrongful arrest. Frustration simmered within him, but he clung to the hope that the truth would come to light and he would soon be released. An investigator from the team entered the room and examined Malik's documents. After additional checks, the investigator seemed puzzled. He made some calls and consulted records, likely to verify the information Malik had provided. Malik glanced at the wall clock, each tick sounding louder and heavier than the last. He knew he needed to stay patient, but the wait was excruciating. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the investigator returned to the room. Mr. Malik, I apologize for the inconvenience, the investigator said in a more conciliatory tone. It appears this situation was a misunderstanding. We've verified all the information, and there is nothing to suggest any illegal activity on your part. You are free to go. Malik left the police station with a bitter mix of relief and anger. His car was still parked outside, and he got in, reflecting on what he had just endured. The frustration and sense of injustice mingled with a fierce determination to seek justice, not just for himself, but for everyone subjected to similar treatment. Once home, Malik went straight to his office to document every detail of the incident. He meticulously noted the names of the officers, the timelines, and the exact exchanges he'd had with them. He knew he would need solid evidence to pursue effective legal action. He also contacted a civil rights attorney, determined to seek redress for the wrongful arrest. The next morning, Malik went to meet his lawyer. After explaining the details of his arrest, his attorney, Maitre Dubois, listened attentively. She was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a piercing gaze that radiated quiet confidence. You are the victim of an arrest without valid grounds, and it's crucial to fight against this to ensure that such injustices don't happen again, she said while reviewing Malik's notes. We will file a formal complaint against the officers involved. It's important to shed light on this type of behavior and hold them accountable." Malik nodded, determined. Maitre Dubois explained the steps necessary to file a complaint, including gathering testimonies, requesting official documents, and pushing for an internal investigation within the police department. Malik's complaint quickly made headlines in the local media. Journalists, drawn to the story of a well-dressed, respectful man accused without apparent reason by law enforcement, began covering the case. Malik found himself in the public eye, increasing pressure on the authorities to provide answers. Over the following weeks, Malik's case became a symbol of police abuse of power. Protests were organized in support of Malik and other victims of similar injustices. Public opinion rallied to demand reforms and measures to prevent police misconduct. On the day of the court hearing, Malik entered the courtroom with renewed determination. The case was widely publicized, and the courtroom was filled with journalists, activists, and citizens interested in the proceedings. Malik sat beside Maitre Dubois, ready to make his voice heard. The stout officer and his colleagues were also present, accompanied by their lawyers. The case was presented before the judge, and Malik testified about the humiliation and stress he had endured. His lawyers presented evidence and witness accounts to demonstrate that the arrest had been racially motivated and lacked any legal basis. As the hearing progressed, Malik felt a mix of nervousness and hope. The judicial process was long and complex, but he knew each step brought him closer to justice. He was determined not only to have the officers' actions recognized as unjust, but also to ensure they led to meaningful changes in the system. The verdict, delivered several months later, marked a significant milestone. The court concluded that the officers had acted in a discriminatory manner and without legal justification. Malik received not only a public apology from the police force, but also financial compensation for the moral and personal harm he had suffered. Moreover, the case spurred a series of internal reforms within the police department, including enhanced bias training and stronger oversight and complaint mechanisms. Although Malik was satisfied with the outcome, he knew this was only part of the fight. He continued to engage in advocacy efforts, sharing his experience to foster discussions on justice and equality. He remained a passionate advocate against abuses of power, hoping his actions would help build a more just society for everyone. Thus, in the end, Malik's story teaches us that even in the darkest moments, it is possible to turn pain into strength and give a voice to those who too often remain in the shadows.